Clara Bow's dark struggles highlight the pressures and mental anguish that she persevered over a century ago. Before Taylor Swift or Stevie Nicks, there was Clara Bow. She was Hollywood's original it girl, a term that has since then become a benchmark for actresses and musical artists. This comparison that's often made by the industry pressures modern stars to meet the same unrealistic standards that Clara herself struggled with in Hollywood. Calling Clara's childhood traumatic would be a major understatement, and it all started before she was born. Robert Bow, Clara's father, wasn't even 2 years old when his mother passed away, giving birth to her 13th child. Robert was raised without any attention, affection, or care, and this carried on to how he raised Clara. Clara's mother, Sarah, was born in Brooklyn in a very unstable household. Sarah's father, Friedrich, often struggled with work and spent the days drinking whiskey and physically abusing his wife. Sarah's mother often struggled with her mental health while having nervous breakdowns. Clara's father, Robert, spent most of his time in downtown Brooklyn, where he would sing at dive bars and then go to brothels to pay for underage girls. This is where he met his future wife, Sarah. To quote the book Clara Bow, Runnin Wild by David Stenn, the union of a loser like Robert to a wretch like Sarah was a match made in hell. So it was grimly appropriate that the reformers referred to the tenement neighborhood into which the newlyweds moved as Hell on Earth. It was located at 160 Sand Street in Brooklyn, New York, which was known as one of the roughest areas in the US at the time. It lacked building regulations, allowing to cram way too many people per building. It allowed landlords to turn closets into their own apartment units and made up to 12 people share one toilet. The area was filled with constant death, with diseases like cholera, smallpox, and scarlet fever. Tuberculosis was so rampant that the neighborhoods had designated areas as lung blocks to help contain the diseases. Infant mortality was so common at this time that 6-foot-high stacks of pine coffins stood outside the buildings waiting to be taken away for burial. Robert worked as a busboy in Brooklyn, and Sarah stayed at home. She unfortunately had complications during 2 pregnancies, and both children passed away. She was warned that if she became pregnant again, it could be fatal for her. Not being able to cope with the reality around her, she decided to try to conceive again as an attempt to end her own life. Robert couldn't have cared any less. He was sick of his wife confronting him about money and mocking his dreams of becoming a singing waiter. Rather than accept reality, he left her. Sarah, now alone and pregnant, had to move back into her brother's apartment that was located above a storefront Baptist church at 697 Bergen Street. A number of months later, Sarah went into labor during a 115-degree Fahrenheit heat wave that hit Brooklyn. Viewing these moments as her last, she did not summon a doctor. To Sarah's relief, the baby appeared to be dead. Then suddenly, the newborn started to cry. Sarah was shocked to find herself and her newborn still alive. Robert heard of the news and he returned to Sarah. They were both still so certain that the baby would pass away that they did not obtain a birth certificate. Clara Bow was born not wanted nor loved on July 29, 1905. It wouldn't be long before Clara realized this lack herself. A few weeks after Clara's first birthday, her grandpa Friedrich had his wife committed to an asylum, where she passed away about a year later. Sarah then felt like she was forced to let Friedrich to live with her and Clara, as Robert would still disappear for months at a time. This led her hatred for her husband and her father to grow stronger. Surprisingly, Friedrich paid a lot of attention to Clara and treated her with kindness. This led her to grow very close to her grandpa, while her parents ignored her. Unfortunately, her relationship with her grandpa would not last long. On January 20th, 1909, Friedrich suddenly had an apoplectic fit while pushing Clara on a swing. Sarah, hearing Clara screaming, brought her out to the scene. Friedrich would then pass away the next day. Clara's mother told her that she wished it was Clara who passed away instead. Despite all of her neglect, Clara still worshipped her mom. She created what one psychiatrist called a very dreamlike existence by placing Sarah on a pedestal. Clara would idealize her mother's aloofness, calling her a princess, it must be true, and that she had good blood in her. Sadly, it wasn't true, and Sarah's mental well-being started to crumble. After an incident in 1911, Clara was told that her mother accidentally fell down a staircase. But given Sarah's mental well-being, it's believed that she attempted to end her own life. Whether she planned to fall or not, Sarah reopened an old head wound, and this led to a quick decline of her mental health. Clara only once and vaguely described the symptoms of her mother, saying, quote, like a woman caught in some trap, where her eyes would grow glassy and she would start to grasp for breath, just like she was being strangled. These seizures would usually happen 3 times a day and then disappear for weeks at a time. Clara felt helpless and powerless watching over her mother. Clara and her mom had to fend for themselves most days, surrounded by death and poverty while living in Brooklyn. They found that being on their own was still better than when Robert would return, on and off. His returns would lead to even more toxic and violent household. Sarah would remind him what a failure he was, and he would take this out on Clara by beating her. While fighting with Sarah, Robert would turn to Clara and say to her, "Don't look at me with that tone of voice," and then slap her so violently that she was thrown to the ground. Clara grew up as a lonely, traumatized child who was very self-conscious of her slight speech impediment. She would be mocked for the way that she spoke and for the clothing that she wore. Clara would say, "I was the worst looking kid on the street." She became a tomboy and involved herself with the teenage gangs around her neighborhood. They would fight each other by using knives or bricks packed into onion sacks, but Clara preferred to use her fists, saying, quote, "I could lick any boy my size," she said with pride. Johnny, a boy who lived in her apartment building, was her only real friend. She imagined him as her kid brother, someone she could protect and play with. She would beat up anyone that bullied him, and she would care for him. One afternoon, Clara heard blood-curdling screams coming from his apartment. She ran downstairs and found him on fire. Screaming her name, he begged her to save him. She rolled him in a rug in an attempt to put out the flames that engulfed his body. Unfortunately, he died in her arms. At just the age of 9, she found herself alone again. In 1916, a cousin allowed Clara and her mom to move into a single room in her Prospect Park brownstone. Clara transferred from PS11 to PS9. I never opened a book, and the teachers was always down on me. In reality, she had a B+ average and a perfect record for conduct. Clara's low self-esteem from her stammer and being bullied by her classmates distorted her reality on how well she actually did in school. They was always hurting my feelings, and I thought they was silly anyways. I never had no use for girls in their games, she said of her classmates. In this lonesome time, when I wasn't much of nothing and I didn't have nobody, one place I could go and forget the misery of home and the heartache of school, that was the motion pictures. Clara would spend all of her spare time going to the movies, finding an escape from her traumatic reality. She made a new friend in the neighborhood to go to the movies with. I was the only one who would listen to her little tales of fantasy, her dreams. She wasn't loved at home, and nobody in the neighborhood bothered with her, so she would confide in me. John would keep Clara company on Sunday afternoons as they sat on the stoop of her cousin's apartment. She would fantasize about how one day she would be in the movies. She believed she could achieve stardom and that it would provide fame, financial stability, and most importantly, love. She told me that she was going to be a great movie star. Of course, I didn't believe her, said John. Her mother forbid Clara any pursuit of her dreams. In Sarah's mind, actresses and sex workers were interchangeable. She confirmed this by observing the heavy makeup worn by both groups walking the streets of New York, as the movie industry built studios there. Quote, "You ain't going into pictures, you ain't gonna be no," derogatory term for a sex worker, viewing either career as a dishonorable way of life. Due to her mental health, Sarah confined herself to bed, exacerbating the neglectful care of her daughter. Clara was her mom's nurse, maid, and confidant. This would keep Clara in a constant state of anxiety that would last for the rest of her life. The Spanish flu hit New York in 1918, turning the apartment buildings of Brooklyn into morgues, with more than 4,500 deaths a week for 6 months straight. This led Robert Bow to somewhat get his shit together. He moved his family to the opposite side of Brooklyn to Sheepshead Bay, which was close to the ocean. Being somewhat distanced from the Spanish flu, Sarah was still able to stay at home but open up her windows and breathe in the fresh oceanside air from their bayfront apartment on Emmons Avenue. Robert was able to get a job as a busboy on Coney Island, where Clara would spend all of her free time if she wasn't at school or the movies. With this, Robert was able to bring in enough money to support his family. Clara said how this led her mother to being almost herself for a year. Sarah even started to pay attention to her daughter by doing things like curling her hair and sewing clothes out of new fabric. Clara mistook this new attention from her mother and again shared her dreams of becoming a movie star. Her mother sneered at her, saying that she was utterly devoid of talent. Clara internalized this to be true until a grammar teacher chose her to play the role of Priscilla in a PS 98 production of Miles Standish. Clara was beyond excited by this news, and she began practicing her lines over and over and over again, which greatly boosted her self-confidence. Just as things seemed to be getting better for Clara and her family, her mother's mental health started to quickly decline again. In February of 1919, Sarah confronted her daughter about her upcoming role in the play. As Clara was doing some laundry on the back porch of their apartment, her mother crept up behind her, saying, "This is a terrible road. You'd be better off dead," followed by an episode of staring off into the distance. Sarah claimed that she had no memory of this incident. Clara then went to her father explaining what had happened. Robert took his wife to a charity clinic and they diagnosed her with a nervous disease which had no cure or treatment. With not being able to find any help for Sarah and her being a danger to herself and Clara, they left Sheepshead Bay and moved back to her cousin's apartment near Prospect Park. The move would take Clara out of school, and her parents ordered her to find work in order to help bring in money. She never got to finish the 8th grade, and this led her to not participating in the play, which crushed her dreams. Despite all of this, Clara still found a way to escape through movie magazines. Her favorite publication was called Motion Pictures, which was filled with photos and stories of the current movie stars. In the 1921 issue of the magazine, Motion Pictures announced the Fame and Fortune Contest, saying, "Through the portal of the Fame and Fortune Contest, you may enter the kingdom of the screen," with the first place prize winning a part in a movie. This was the only chance a person like Clara could get, and she desperately wanted it. But there was a problem. She had to have 2 photos of herself to enter the contest. She didn't have any photos of herself, nor the money to get them taken. Sarah's past abusive disapproval of Clara's desired career left her no choice but to ask her father for help. Robert agreed to help, and he took Clara to a cheap studio on Coney Island, where he paid $1 for 2 photos. Clara hated how they turned out, calling them terrible. This wouldn't stop her though. Hiding her actions from her mother with the help of her father, Clara rode the streetcar to the publication's office in downtown Brooklyn. She took the photos directly to the Fame and Fortune contest manager. Clara would leave feeling foolish for entering the contest, saying it was silly to even dream of it. There wasn't no one who knew me who would have laughed long and loud at the idea. To her surprise, on September 2nd, 1921, she, along with a dozen other contestants, took a bus to Eugene Brewster, the publisher of Motion Pictures, to do screen tests. A week later, she received a letter inviting her back to participate further in the contest. She was greeted with snickering by the other finalists as she arrived, and she knew why, saying, "I was wearing the one and only thing that I owned, a little plaid dress, a sweater, and a red tam." She realized she didn't consider the appearance of her outfit, saying, "I only looked at my face, and that was disappointing enough." The finalists were instructed to walk into frame, pick up a phone, laugh, look worried, and then terrified. Out of the 10 contestants, 9 of them fought to go first. The 10th stayed quiet in a corner, observing. Quote, "I sat through every one of those tests, watching everything that was done, everything they was told, every mistake they made. The trouble was, I thought, that they was all trying to do it like somebody they'd seen on the screen, not the way that they do it themselves." Claire's observation and instinct of individuality was way beyond her years at her age of 16 with no acting experience. Her hours of imitating other actresses led her to understand that in order to stand out, she just must be herself. Clara continued to attend the competition over the following weeks, and she expected to be eliminated at the end of each round. To her surprise, the judges were very impressed with her performances. Clara made it to the point where it was just her and one other final contestant, who was from San Antonio, Texas, named Lula Hubbard. After one last final test, they were sent home, and the announcement of the winner would be made later. When Clara arrived home later that day, she found her mom hunched over in a chair, with her eyes glazed over. "Where you been?" her mother asked her in a cold tone. Clara decided to tell her the truth. I told her it looked like I had a chance to win the contest, and if I did, it meant a job in motion pictures and a chance to make a good, and I could do lots of things for her. Sarah then fainted, falling out of her chair. Clara rushed over, trying to wake her mom up, but she couldn't. Clara shook her, patted her face, and threw water on her. Nothing was waking her up. Clara was terrified that she killed her mom. Sarah then suddenly woke up, saying, "You're going straight to hell. I'd rather see you dead." Clara said how Sarah stared at her, quote, with those awful, burning eyes, and her face was so white and still. Blaming herself for what had just happened, Clara broke down into tears and promised to give up any hope of a career in acting. 3 days later, the winner of the Brewster Publications Fame and Fortune contest was announced, choosing Clara Bow. She had just won the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity of her dreams, yet unfortunately, her joy faded away as her mother insisted she give up her prize. Thankfully, for Clara's sake, the publishing house didn't allow that. The Brewster organization then took Clara to Greenwich Village for a professional photo shoot. And since Clara lived in Brooklyn, they allocated the travel expenses to purchase her a new outfit. Besides all this, neither attention nor work came Clara's way for some time. She felt the hopes of her dreams to slip away. Quote, "Panic was driving me crazy. After all I'd been through, was this gonna be a failure?" Clara's guilt grew stronger than ever for defying her mother with no work in sight, and blaming herself for the increase in her mother's spells. Finally, a role opened up for her in a movie called Beyond the Rainbow. She got the role of playing the lead character's little sister, and she would get $50 for 1 week of work, which would be about $875 today. But before she could start, she had to have 4 dresses from her own wardrobe. Clara then visited her wealthy aunt, who shared her same name, Clara Bow, and asked if she could help her out. Her aunt threw Clara out of the house and wrote to her father saying that she disgraced the family. But Clara was thankful to a cousin who lent her $80, which would be about $1,400 today, to help complete her wardrobe. The next day, she started work on her first film. But it started off rough, with her not knowing how to do her own makeup and none of the other actresses wanting to help her out. This led the director, Christy Caban, to question and ridicule Clara's use of makeup. But she was able to redeem herself when Clara impressed Caban by crying on demand. Caban wondered how Clara learned and where she got this talent, but Clara kept it to herself. Quote, "It was easy to cry. All I had to do was think of home," Clara said. Clara's mother's hate for her daughter's career choice grew from not only verbal, but to physical threats after her work on Beyond the Rainbow. One night, Clara woke up to her mother hovering over her with a butcher knife in her hand. "I'm gonna kill ya, Clara. It'll be better," she said as she pinned Clara to the bed. Sarah then put the knife to Clara's throat, ready to kill her, but suddenly she fainted before she could do anything. The next morning, Sarah woke up with no memory of the event happening, but of course, Clara couldn't get it out of her head. This marked the beginning of Clara's lifelong battle with insomnia. Fans would learn about her sleeplessness and tie it to her public image, but Clara never shared the true traumatic reasons with them. Clara rarely spoke about her childhood, not wanting her traumas to be exploited for publicity. Once, she spoke with a journalist, saying, "I have known hunger, believe me." When another asked for further detail, she replied, "We just lived. That's about all." The film Beyond the Rainbow released on February 19th, 1922. On opening day, Clara invited 2 of her classmates from grammar school to go with her, in hopes that them seeing her in a movie would make them feel guilty for the way that they bullied her. Sadly, the opposite happened. With the film being long and it having 16 major characters, the director had to make cuts, and Clara was one of them. Eventually, her scenes would be added back to the film, but Clara's current disappointment left her feeling hopeless and unsure of the future. When Clara's mom learned about this, she made it her duty to kill Clara before she could work in another film. She chased Clara around the apartment with the butcher knife and then kicked her out onto the streets. Clara would wander Coney Island for days until her father found her and brought her home. Robert had had enough. He had no desire to take care of his wife, and he couldn't let Clara do it either. Clara somehow defended her mom, saying she wasn't insane. She could answer any questions, talk, be calm. Then these spells would come on. With Robert being inconsistent in her life, her mom was all that she had, creating a dark relationship of Clara defending and depending on her mother who was trying to kill her. 16 years after Sarah's father brought his wife to an asylum, Robert took Sarah to the same facility a week after the premiere of Beyond the Rainbow. Clara said how she suffered from a nervous breakdown during this time, but she had trouble recalling most of it. Before she would receive intensive psychotherapy, she could only recall 2 facts: that she and Robert moved into an apartment in the Bay Ridge area of Brooklyn, and that she continued to look for film work. At this point, Clara was convinced that winning the contest hadn't meant a thing. I wore myself out going from studio to studio, from agency to agency, applying to every possible part, but there was always something. Elmer Clifton, a director that was casting a low-budget whaling saga called Down to the Sea in Ships, needed cheap talent. He noticed that Clara was a Fame and Fortune contest winner, and he thought she would be the perfect fit. Clara tried to predict what the director wanted by borrowing a dress and putting on heavy makeup. When she arrived, the director Clifton said, "You're way too old for this part," and Clara exclaimed, "I'm only 16." Clifton smiled and shook his head in disbelief. She then rushed home and returned to Clifton in a changed outfit, putting on her old, worn-out clothing and removing her makeup. Her drive led Clifton to hiring her for a 2-week trial, where she was paid $35 a week, which would be about $650 today. Clifton was very impressed by Clara's performance while on location in New Bedford, Massachusetts. The 2-week trial turned into 13. She was given the role to play a character that she could relate to, Dot Morgan. Dot was a tomboyish kid sister to the main character, who would beat up boys and then pretend to be one of them as a stowaway on a ship to escape her repressive Quaker family. Clara found herself away from home for the very first time, alone and without any friends on set. She found herself sleepless during those 13 weeks, and any chance of sleep she did get, she would dream of her mother trying to kill her, which would then wake her up crying. After filming, Clara returned home to Brooklyn. Exhausted, she went straight to the asylum to see her mother. Sarah then had ordered Clara to secure her release. She begged Robert to bring her home, but he refused. Clara tried to help by asking her cousin that lived in the brownstone if they could stay there, but the cousin was unwilling. In a bit of a change for the better, Sarah stopped her verbal and physical abuse towards Clara, and she ignored her hatred for her daughter's career. With Down to the Sea in the Ships not having premiered yet, Clara struggled to find work with her weak resume. That is until late 1922, when William Randolph Hearst's Cosmopolitan Pictures hired her as an extra for the film Enemies of Women. One day, Sarah demanded that she join Clara at the studio. Clara told her no, and Sarah replied, "You're ashamed of me. You think I'm crazy." Clara then became terrified when her mother suddenly went into a canatotic state that would only be interrupted by her spells that left her gasping for air. Clara had become more and more terrified, keeping her mother's condition a secret while she worked on set. The film's juvenile lead, William Collier Jr., met Clara and rightfully so assumed that she was scared to death. But he assumed that this anxiety was due to her inexperience of working on set. Only Clara knew the true reason. "I cried my eyes out when I left my mama in the morning." On New Year's Eve, Sarah was readmitted to the asylum, and she was pronounced terminally insane. Robert then authorized Sarah to be transferred to the same facility where her mother had died. On Friday, January 5th, 1923, a day before her transfer, Sarah had passed away. Robert traveled to the studio to tell the news to Clara. During the funeral service, Clara didn't cry at all. Nor did she while on the ferry to Staten Island, where Sarah was to be buried next to her parents. But then Clara snapped as her mother's coffin was lowered into the ground. She came to life and went crazy. I tried to jump in after her. Clara would cry for years and years, blaming herself for her mother's death. "I disappointed her. I went against her wishes," said Clara. Clara now only had Robert in her life. He convinced her to not obey her mother's last wish of Clara leaving acting, even though she vowed to. The reasoning for Robert was more financial than anything. Clara brought in more money than he did now. The film Down to the Sea in Ships finally released 2 months later. Critics did not like the film, but they loved and praised Clara's performance. She stood out among the other actors. Her acting appeared much more natural and alive, leading to her high praise. Although she was still processing the despair of her mother's death, her newfound success led her to falling in love. Clara, who was just about to turn 18, met 21-year-old Arthur Jacobson. He was a second cameraman for The Film Guide. The Film Guide was a group of Ivy League graduates who made indie movies with almost no budget. It commissioned their college friend F. Scott Fitzgerald to write a story for them. He came up with Grit, which was a story about revenge in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Clara, who is known among the Guide for her work in Down to the Sea and Ships, was asked to come in for screen tests. She jumped right off the screen, recalls Arthur. She immediately got the job. She then expressed her gratitude to Arthur, and after 3 days of working together, they fell in love. Every Saturday evening, they would leave Long Island City's Pyramid Studios and take the train to Brooklyn. They would arrive to their favorite Chinese restaurant on Fulton Street, where a little bit of money went a long way. Clara and Arthur would spend hours there, just looking at each other. God, we must have been dopey, Clara recalled. When the restaurant closed for the day, they would go to the Flatbush neighborhood in Brooklyn. After Sarah passed away, Robert and Clara got an apartment there. Shortly after Clara got home, Arthur would make the trip back to his house in the Bronx. After getting a few hours of sleep, he would take the train back to Brooklyn, where he would spend every Sunday with Clara. They would go to either Prospect Park or Coney Island. They would walk hand in hand along the boardwalk to Coney Island. They would stop at Nathan's for a hot dog and then ride the Ferris wheel. Clara and Arthur's relationship continued to grow, and Arthur hoped to be able to escape the helicoptering of Robert. Arthur convinced his cousin to invite Robert to a regular Sunday night pinochle game. Now Arthur and Clara had the entire apartment to themselves. When Robert left the pinochle game, Arthur's cousin would call Clara to tell her that her father was on the way. By the time that he got back, Clara and Arthur were outside on the stoop, with Robert none the wiser. Clara's role in Grit was her best work so far. A little roughneck tomboy like me, said Clara about the character that she played. The director said of Clara, this dynamic and erratic roadwind was a joy to her director, one of the most arresting personalities the screen has ever known. Unfortunately, no copies of Grit remain today, but we know that the quality turned out to be lower than the budget that they had. Scott Fitzgerald wrote, Christ, the whole picture is sordid, showing disgusting scenes of immorality and crime. Variety had a more publishable opinion of Scott Fitzgerald's thoughts on the film, while praising Clara for her work. The Officer of Preferred Pictures, an indie production company in Hollywood, traveled to New York to the Grit set, and he would discover Clara's talents. The next thing she knew, she was offered to work with them in California. Robert then brought her to Grand Central Station, and they said their goodbyes. There, she met her agent, Maxine Alton, who would accompany her for the trip. Clara boarded the train that promised her a new life, filled with her wildest dreams, leaving behind the trauma that she grew up with. Or so she hoped. And that brings us to the end of part 1. Thanks for watching. Part 2 will come out in July of 2024. Don't forget to like and subscribe and ding that bell icon if you want to get notified when part 2 comes out. If it's past July 2024, you can watch part 2 right here. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.